Hi, my name is Charlotte Hale. I'm 38 years old, and I walked into our 20-year high school reunion wearing a plain navy blue dress and an even plainer name tag. Within the first 5 minutes, I was reminded that in the eyes of my stepfamily, I had never amounted to much and probably never would. The valet barely looked at me when I handed over my keys. I murmured a polite thank you, tucked my clutch under my arm, and stepped through the grand double doors of the Oak Ridge Hills Country Club in Sycamore Springs, Virginia. The chandelier above the lobby sparkled like something stolen from Versailles, gaudy and expensive, designed to remind you that this place belonged to people like them. Not me. From inside, I heard the soft hum of conversation, the clink of wine glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter. Just before I entered the ballroom, the concierge handed me a name tag. It read Charlotte Hale in basic serif font. No title, no credentials, no distinction. That was Natalie's doing, I was sure of it. I still wore my West Point ring, tucked beneath my sleeve where no one could see it. That was by design. The ballroom doors opened wide like a theater unveiling its stage. The room shimmered with warm light and polished affluence. Long banquet tables lined with ivory linens and over-the-top floral centerpieces stretched across the floor. In the front, a 6-tier cake gleamed under a spotlight. Above it all, a massive screen played a looped slideshow of senior year memories, prom, debate club, cheerleaders, our class trip to D.C. Natalie was in nearly every photo. I was in maybe 3. Natalie Hale, my stepsister, was already on stage when I entered. She stood under the spotlight like she was born for it, dressed in a fitted scarlet sheath that clung to her like a medal of power. Her voice poured through the microphone with polished ease. And after 15 years at the Department of Justice, she said, laughing gently, I'm proud to say I've recently been appointed Deputy Director of Federal Cyber Oversight. Applause. She beamed. But I'll never forget where it all began. Right here at Sycamore High. Then, as if on cue, she added, and of course, I want to thank my sister Charlotte, who is with us tonight, for always being uniquely herself. The crowd chuckled, unsure whether it was a joke or a compliment. I didn't flinch. That was Natalie's specialty, using gratitude like a scalpel. I made my way to the back of the room, to table 14, right next to the buffet trays and near the emergency exit. The front tables had gold-embossed name cards, Senator Whitaker, Dr. Camille Hart, CEO Victor Lang, and of course, Natalie Hale, Deputy Director. I sat down at a table with no centerpiece and a half-eaten shrimp cocktail shared between 3 strangers. From across the ballroom, I spotted her, Margaret Hale, my stepmother. She was standing near the head table in a champagne-colored silk dress, her posture upright, her pearl necklace shining under the chandeliers. She hadn't aged much. Still the same cold grace. Still the same expertly concealed disdain. When she noticed me, her expression flickered, something between forced surprise and distant disappointment. She made her way over, walking like royalty through her subjects. When she arrived at my table, she looked me over as if trying to figure out what exactly she was supposed to say. Charlotte, she said with an overly pleasant smile, I almost didn't recognize you in that classic navy. Is it vintage? It's just a dress, I replied calmly. Well, you've always been practical, she said, head tilting with a smile that felt more like judgment than praise. I must say, I wasn't sure you'd actually show up tonight. I'm here. She leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice. You know, it might have helped if you'd RSVP'd. There was some confusion with the slideshow and the seating chart. But I told Natalie not to worry. You always find your way to the back row. I stared at her, expression still. Some of us are used to working from the shadows. That seemed to rattle her for just a split second. Then she smiled again, tight and triumphant. Well, she said, we're just glad you could make it. Everyone's curious what you've been up to, although I imagine it's hard to explain that kind of lifestyle in a setting like this. Before I could respond, she excused herself, turning back toward the head table where Natalie was now laughing with someone from the mayor's office. I picked up my water glass and held it steady, even though my hand had started to tremble slightly. The weight of silence settled in around me, not because I felt out of place, but because I was so used to being invisible in rooms like this. What they didn't know was that I had briefed generals in secure rooms underneath the earth, operated in foreign territories they'd only seen in documentaries, and written protocols that protected every system they used to build their so-called success. They saw me as a woman who had faded into obscurity, but I had never disappeared. I had simply gone where they couldn't follow. And tonight, the story they thought they'd written about me would begin to unravel. The evening rolled on like a slow, glistening parade of old names and borrowed titles. Waiters moved with clockwork precision, delivering steak medallions and garlic mashed potatoes to guests who barely looked up from their conversations. Laughter rang out, but it was thin and rehearsed, like an echo from the past that had forgotten how to be genuine. Margaret had returned to her spot beside Natalie at the front table, where they posed for photos with prominent alumni and local officials. One of the waitstaff refilled my water glass twice. I still hadn't touched it. The slideshow continued to loop. Natalie at prom, Natalie in debate club, Natalie on the White House lawn. She stood in the frame of the projector's glow like she belonged there, her confidence shining brighter than the chandeliers above. At one point, she rose to deliver another speech, this one less formal, more intimate. I think what makes this class special, she said with practiced humility, is that so many of us have become leaders. In our careers, our communities, our families. She turned, glancing toward Margaret, who nodded in approval. Then her eyes drifted, right to me. And some of us, she added, pausing just long enough to sting, chose other paths. Quieter paths. Which is valid too. Sometimes silence is strength. Soft laughter rippled across the room. I didn't move. Natalie smiled like she'd made a generous gesture. That was her art, offering barbed compliments so carefully wrapped in silk, you didn't realize they were cutting you until you bled. Then came the whispers. I heard one woman say, "Didn't she drop out of law school?" Someone else added, "No, I think she went into the military. Probably admin work or logistics. She left sophomore year, right?" Another voice chimed in. I always wondered what happened to her. I didn't bother turning my head. They didn't know what happened, because Margaret and Natalie had made sure no one ever would. It had started quietly years ago. A suggestion that my name be removed from the alumni achievement list. A request to the school board that I not be contacted for awards or features because I preferred privacy. An email signed with my name, sent by Natalie from her Department of Justice address. And no one questioned it, because people like Margaret and Natalie never gave anyone reason to. They erased me not by slander, but by omission. They didn't defame my name. They simply made it vanish.
And it worked.
I had spent the last decade serving in places no one dared speak aloud. I had held clearance levels that Margaret couldn't dream of understanding, and I had led operations that would never see a podium, a plaque, or a published paper. I didn't need a title on a slideshow, but I did need to reclaim the truth. At that moment, someone sat beside me. I turned, surprised. It was Melissa Green. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with silver at the temples, but her eyes were the same, sharp, quiet, curious. She gave me a small smile. I was wondering when you'd show up. I almost didn't, I said honestly. I'm glad you did. She looked across the ballroom, toward Natalie and Margaret. You're not going to let them finish the story for you, are you? I looked down at my hands. They already did. Years ago. No, she said firmly. They tried. That's not the same thing. We sat in silence for a moment. The quartet played a slow rendition of a song I barely remembered from prom. Melissa's eyes didn't leave the front of the room. I nominated you, you know, she said suddenly, for the Distinguished Alumni Award. 5 years ago. I turned to her. You what? I pulled everything I could find, your early record at West Point, what little I could reference that wasn't classified. The committee said you declined. My stomach dropped. They forwarded me an email from your DOJ contact, she continued. Said you didn't want public attention. I closed my eyes briefly. Natalie. I never wrote that, I said. I know, she replied.
Now.
She reached into her clutch and pulled out a small, folded paper. I kept it. It was a printed email. Official letterhead. Formal language. Thank you for your interest in honoring Lieutenant Charlotte Hale. At this time, she has chosen to maintain anonymity in accordance with ongoing assignments. We respectfully ask that no further inquiry be made. Signed, Anne Hale. Office of the Deputy Director. Cyber Oversight Division. My hands tightened around the page. They hadn't just buried my name. They'd forged my silence. Melissa laid a hand over mine. It's not too late. I looked up. Natalie was laughing at something now, perfectly composed beneath the warm lights. Margaret clapped beside her, her pearl bracelet catching the light like applause. I folded the email and slid it into my bag. They thought I had vanished into irrelevance. But I had never been more present than I was now. The air inside the ballroom had shifted. The initial thrill of reunions had settled into a comfortable smugness. Groups clustered near the bar, old classmates snapping selfies with carefully curated angles, and overfed praise echoing through practiced toasts. I remained in the shadows, seated at table 14 as if by design. From where I sat, I could see the looping slideshow continue its rhythm. Natalie on debate team, Natalie in front of the Capitol building, Natalie mid-speech at Harvard Law. And then, for exactly 2 seconds, a photo I hadn't seen in years.
Me.
18 years old. Cadet uniform. Standing in formation under the stone arch of West Point. I blinked. And then it was gone, replaced by another image of Natalie, this time shaking hands with a senator. A flicker. That's all it took to break something loose in my memory. I remembered the moment I had sent in my acceptance letter to West Point. I had told my father first. He was quiet, proud, steady. But Margaret had simply raised an eyebrow and said, "That's a rather severe path. Are you sure it's not a phase?" Natalie hadn't even looked up from her phone.
It was always like that. Dismissed.
Muted. Shrunk. I should have pushed back more. I should have demanded space on the wall, on the list, in the narrative. But I didn't. Because at the time, I thought serving quietly would speak for itself. I was wrong. Silence is an invitation for people like Margaret and Natalie to write the story for you. Melissa rejoined me at the table, holding 2 glasses of water. There was more, she said, voice low. I checked into the alumni archive database last month. Your name wasn't listed in the Hall of Honor. I asked why. They said it was removed at the family's request. For consistency. Consistency? I repeated, bitterness rising in my throat. Melissa nodded. Apparently, it was suggested that because you didn't follow the Ivy League path and weren't in public service roles, it might confuse the narrative of success they were trying to highlight. Of course. Margaret's obsession with optics. Natalie's obsession with being the only one shining. I clenched my hands in my lap. They hadn't just edited me out of a slideshow. They had rewritten me out of my own life. Melissa leaned closer. You don't have to stay in the shadows anymore. I didn't stay, I said quietly. I was sent. I stood and excused myself. My hands were steady now. I walked past the restrooms, around the curve of the reception hallway, and entered the private lounge reserved for speakers and event planners.
No one noticed me.
No one stopped me. Why would they? I didn't matter to them. Inside, I opened my clutch and retrieved the one thing I always carried when I traveled, a matte black access key with no identifying marks. I slipped it into the slim tablet I kept beneath a false panel in my bag. It came alive in seconds, retinal scan, voice recognition, encrypted login. Hail, Charlotte. Clearance level echo. Access granted. The interface glowed pale blue as a digital map flickered to life, showing 4 active breach zones marked in red. Project Sentinel. Status. Compromised. Data scrolled in silence. The breach indicators were clustered near domestic nodes, government subnets, a defense contractor in Phoenix, and 1 flagged alert traced through a DOJ secondary gateway. My eyes narrowed. The internal trace point bore a familiar routing string. Natalie's office. Coincidence? Unlikely. I flagged it, locked the terminal, and closed the device. Outside the lounge, I rejoined the crowd like I had never left. I took my seat, smiled faintly, folded my hands, and waited. Natalie and Margaret thought I had disappeared, but I was still here. And now, I had a reason to speak. The night wore on like a well-dressed lie. Natalie mingled near the bar with a local news anchor, laughing with her head tilted just right for the camera. Margaret circled the front tables with effortless grace, exchanging knowing nods and gracious smiles, as if she were the true host of the evening. Neither of them glanced in my direction. They didn't need to. As far as they were concerned, I was a shadow in the background, static in their perfectly tuned broadcast. I remained seated, calm on the outside, fire underneath. Melissa sat beside me again, sipping her wine slowly. "They're not going to stop, are they?" she asked. "No," I said, "because they think they've already won." She looked over at the front. "They really did erase you." I nodded. "But I've been documenting it all." Melissa tilted her head. "Documenting?" "I don't fight back with words," I said. "I fight with records." Every time they rewrote history, I made a copy of the original. She stared at me, her eyes widening slightly. "You knew this would happen?" "Eventually," I said. "People like Margaret and Natalie, they don't build power. They consume it. Anyone who doesn't serve their story gets cut out." A waiter passed by with a tray of drinks. I declined with a small shake of my head. I needed my focus clear. I pulled out my tablet again, this time using the encrypted line to ping my contact at the Sentinel Division. The interface responded immediately. New threat alert scrolled across the screen, 3 confirmed breaches, and a 4th flagged for immediate analysis. All domestic. One matched the DOJ's internal routing system. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to escalate. And I would escalate it. Before the end of this night. I slid the device back into my clutch, just as the MC stepped up to the microphone again. He was older now, balding, but still clung to the same booming voice he had used as prom DJ 2 decades earlier. "And now, folks, the highlight of the evening," he announced cheerfully. "Your 2003 Most Distinguished Alumni Award recipient." I already knew what was coming. He grinned toward the head table. "She's brilliant, accomplished, and a federal star. Please welcome our very own Deputy Director of Cyber Oversight, Natalie Hale." The applause that followed was loud, unanimous, unquestioning. Natalie stood slowly, as if crowned by the moment itself. She glided toward the stage, heels clicking in rhythm, red dress catching the light with every step. Margaret dabbed her eyes dramatically, clasping her hands like a proud monarch. I didn't clap. Not because I wasn't capable of respect, but because I had watched the scene too many times from too far away, knowing how much of it had been built on omissions. Natalie reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and smiled as the room settled into a hush. "Thank you all," she said, her voice carrying confidence and charm in equal measure. "This honor means more to me than I can express. When I walked through the doors of Sycamore High all those years ago, I never imagined I'd be standing here like this." She paused for effect. But time has a funny way of revealing who we are. Some of us rise, some of us lead, and some of us choose to stand quietly in the background. Another carefully measured pause. A few chuckles. My name wasn't mentioned, but everyone felt it. "I've always believed that true leadership," she continued, "doesn't hide. It steps forward. It speaks up. And I'm proud to be part of a legacy that values clarity over mystery." Polite applause. Melissa looked at me, frowning. "She's calling you out without even saying your name." "That's her specialty," I said softly. "She thinks being louder makes her more true." From my bag, my secure line vibrated once, an incoming alert. Command escalation approved. Senior briefing requested. Agent retrieval window open. They were ready. And now so was I. I stood up quietly. Across the ballroom, Margaret's eyes landed on me for the first time in hours. She turned to Natalie, whispering something. I didn't wait. I walked out of the ballroom and into the long marbled hallway, the sound of the crowd fading behind me. The ceiling lights glimmered overhead as I approached the far end of the corridor, where a figure waited silently near the reception desk. Colonel Marcus Ellison. He stood tall, in full dress uniform, his cap tucked under one arm, ribbons across his chest, posture sharp. Guests had paused mid-conversation, watching him curiously. He turned toward me as I approached and, with crisp precision, raised his hand in salute. "Lieutenant General Hale," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "The Pentagon requests your presence for immediate consultation on Project Sentinel. Intel brief is prepared. We're ready for transport." The entire lobby went still. Someone gasped. A wine glass slipped from a woman's hand and shattered. Margaret stepped into the hall, frozen. Natalie appeared behind her, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide, her flawless red lips parted in disbelief. I returned the colonel's salute with calm exactness. "Understood. Give me 1 minute." I turned to face the stunned crowd. And I said nothing, because this wasn't a moment for words. This was the truth they had refused to see. And now they couldn't look away. Colonel Ellison remained motionless beside me, his stance a portrait of discipline. The gold accents of his uniform caught the lobby lights. His voice had not been raised, and yet it had cut through the room like thunder. Behind him, conversations had stopped mid-sentence. Forks hovered above plates. People stood frozen, watching. Whispers began to build along the carpeted hallway, reaching into the ballroom where the music had faded into awkward silence. Natalie stood just outside the doorway now, her expression trying to compose itself. But the cracks showed. She looked between me and the colonel, disbelief slowly contorting into something harsher. Fear. Margaret took a cautious step forward. She blinked hard, then forced a smile, tight, practiced, hollow. "Wait," she said, her voice carefully light. "Did he say, General?" I turned slightly toward her. "Lieutenant General," I said evenly. Her lips parted, but no words came. Natalie finally spoke. "You're in the military?" Her tone wasn't curious. It was accusatory. "For 2 decades," I answered. "Most of it classified." Someone behind her let out a sharp gasp. Another voice near the bar whispered, "Did she say General?" Ellison stepped forward, handing me a sealed black folder. The label bore an official Pentagon seal. A hush fell like a weighted curtain. He lowered his voice just enough for me to hear, but not so low that it couldn't be overheard. "Ma'am, breach indicators have escalated. Sentinel files were accessed through a compromised DOJ pathway." My jaw set. "Natalie's division." He gave the smallest nod. "Intel is still being confirmed, but your insight is now mandatory." I opened the folder and scanned the summary page. I had seen dozens like it before, redacted code names, blinking risk charts, satellite pings. But this one had my name in the response chain. The situation was real. Margaret tried again. "Charlotte, is this a stunt? A performance of some kind?" I looked at her. "You told them I dropped out. You erased me from the records. Called my service unfit for legacy." She flushed, for once without words. Natalie took 2 steps forward, her heels clicking sharply on the marble. "I didn't know," she said. "No one told me." "You told the alumni board I wanted to be removed from the honor roll," I said, my voice calm but clear. "You forged my withdrawal." "That's not true," she said too quickly. "I have the email." A pause. And then Melissa appeared, stepping from behind the crowd with her phone in hand. "I do too," she said, loud enough for the nearest 10 people to hear. "I printed it. I kept everything." Heads turned. Natalie's eyes flashed, and she turned toward Margaret. "I was protecting our image," she said, her voice lowering, sharp with resentment.
She left.
"She chose obscurity." "No," I said, stepping forward. "I chose duty." I looked around at the gathering faces. Most of them I hadn't seen in 20 years. Some didn't remember me at all. But tonight they were seeing me, truly, for the first time. A voice from the ballroom piped up. "Is this real?" Another guest whispered, "She's a general?" A third added, "My God, I thought she worked in HR." Laughter rippled, nervous, confused, unprepared. Melissa's voice broke through again. She briefed NATO. She led counterintelligence in Eastern Europe. She stopped a cyber attack that could have shut down half the country's power grid. You just didn't care to ask. Natalie's mouth opened again, but I cut her off. You build a career by standing in the spotlight, I said. I built mine making sure the lights never went out. No one laughed now. Colonel Ellison checked his watch. Ma'am, transport departs in 10 minutes. I gave him a nod. Natalie looked dazed. You lied to us. No, I replied. You just never listened. Margaret sat down slowly on the edge of a chair in the hall, the weight of what she'd buried now pressing visibly against her carefully composed posture. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. I turned to the growing crowd and finally let myself say it. I served in silence. But silence doesn't mean absence. Some of us protect without needing applause. A hush fell again. Then slowly someone began to clap. One pair of hands. Then another. And another. The room filled with a slow, unsure, but undeniable applause. Not loud, but real. I gave Melissa a nod. She was crying, quietly, the way people cry when a truth they always knew finally becomes undeniable. Ellison offered me a final nod. We're ready when you are, General. I turned back to Natalie one last time. You didn't erase me, I said. You just postponed the moment I'd be seen. Then I walked past her, and the silence she used to control now followed me. Not to hide me, but to honor me. The next morning, I sat by the window of my hotel room at Oak Ridge Hills. The sunlight spilled across the perfectly trimmed gardens, but there was no peace in me. The confrontation last night had stirred everything I had worked so hard to suppress. The military had confirmed it. There was a breach. Files were accessed. Intentional. Strategic. And someone had lied on my behalf years ago to keep me out of public records. The name on the forged request to withdraw my Medal of Honor nomination wasn't a stranger. It was Margaret, my stepmother. At 9 a.m., there was a quiet knock. I opened the door to find Melissa standing there, her face pale and tense. She walked in slowly, carrying a thick envelope in her hands like it was made of glass. I brought it, she said. Everything I could find. I shut the door and motioned her to sit. She didn't. She laid the envelope on the desk and stepped back, folding her arms. I opened it. Inside were printed emails, reports, old copies of alumni correspondence, carefully highlighted and organized. My name appeared repeatedly, usually in drafts of announcements and nomination letters from military agencies and school committees. But each of those letters had a final version, with my name suddenly removed. One document caught my eye immediately. A reply to the Department of Defense's inquiry about public recognition.
It read,
Per request from the family, Lieutenant General Charlotte Hale has opted to decline any public honors. Due to her sensitive operational history and expressed desire for privacy, all recognitions should be kept internal only. At the bottom, it was signed, Margaret Hale, Senior Liaison, Community Relations, Board of Governors. I stared at the name. She forged it, I asked, my voice steady but low. Melissa nodded. She used her title. They never questioned it. You were on deployment. She handled the paperwork through her contacts in D.C. They thought she was speaking on your behalf. I leaned back slowly. She erased me. She wanted Natalie to shine, Melissa said quietly. You returning home with medals and attention didn't fit the story she built around her real daughter. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe. I never even knew the nomination happened. You were overseas. She intercepted the letter. I found the original scan. Your name was typed, the envelope never opened. She replied through her own contact. I picked up the copy of the email, held it up to the light, and whispered. She took my silence and rewrote it into submission. Melissa looked like she wanted to cry. I don't know how you stayed so composed last night. I've lived with being unseen, I said. But this was theft. Not of medals. Of legacy. Just then my secure phone buzzed. It was a coded message from the Pentagon. DOJ audit proceeding. Suspected manipulation of service records confirmed. Allegations source tied to civilian family contact. Further investigation approved. Your in-person briefing required Monday 0800 hours. I stared at the message. Margaret was now under official scrutiny. Melissa watched me read. They're opening the case? I nodded. She's not just a stepmother with control issues anymore. She's a federal suspect in falsifying military records. I stood up and walked to the window. Below, the garden was quiet. A few guests wandered with coffee cups in hand, unaware of the storm gathering overhead. I was willing to stay in the background, I said. I made peace with being overlooked. But now I see it wasn't oversight. It was a coordinated erasure. Melissa stepped beside me. You deserve to be heard.
No, I said.
I deserve to be remembered. Rightly. I looked back at the folder on the table. Starting Monday, I said, this won't be about a family reunion anymore. This is about restoring truth, without apology. The days leading up to Monday passed like the calm before a storm. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Meetings were held, reports reviewed, and formal briefings exchanged. But beneath it all, tension coiled tighter with every hour. I spent most of my time preparing documentation and timelines, organizing the evidence Melissa had uncovered. The folder had grown thicker each day. I didn't call Margaret. I didn't need to. The silence between us said more than words could. By Sunday evening, I was back at Fort Kingswell, walking down the narrow corridor of the operations wing. The echo of my boots against the polished floor reminded me of who I was. Not just a name that had been erased, but a soldier who had returned with scars, discipline, and a memory sharp enough to cut through the lies. I met with Colonel Ellison in his office just after 1900 hours. He was standing by the window, arms folded, the city lights flickering in the distance behind him. She's being officially named in the inquiry, he said as I entered. Margaret Hale. Records falsification, interference with federal honors, unauthorized access to classified files. I sat across from him, steady. She had helped. He nodded. We suspect Natalie was involved as well. She signed off on 2 of the communications as a DOJ deputy. We've already flagged it for internal review. That hit harder than I expected.
Natalie.
My stepsister. The one who'd smiled in every family photo while quietly ensuring I disappeared from history. I remembered sitting at the dinner table after my first deployment, her talking over me, Margaret constantly praising her internships, her speaking engagements, her published articles. Any time I mentioned a mission or overseas detail, the topic was swiftly changed. At the time, I thought it was just family awkwardness. Now I knew it had been calculated. Colonel Ellison continued, "We'll be assigning a public relations officer and a legal advisor. This is going to draw attention." "I don't want a media circus," I said. He gave a small nod. "Understood. But we can't control all of it." Monday morning, I stood in full uniform before a 3-person review panel inside the base's legal wing. Behind closed doors, with security clearance required just to enter the hallway, I gave my full testimony. I laid out everything, what Melissa discovered, the emails Margaret altered, the DOJ records Natalie submitted, and how they used their positions to overwrite military decisions I had never even known were made. The lead official, a composed woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a neutral expression, listened carefully. When I finished, she asked just one question. "Why didn't you speak sooner?" I met her gaze. "Because I didn't know I was silenced." She nodded, as if she'd heard those words before, just not in this context. By late afternoon, the hearing concluded. I stepped outside into the bright Virginia sun and exhaled for the first time in hours. Melissa was waiting across the lot in a parked vehicle, engine idling. I climbed in without speaking. "What now?" she asked quietly. "Now we let the truth breathe," I replied. The next day, Margaret's name hit the internal bulletin. Disciplinary proceedings were initiated. Her access to the Board of Governors was suspended. She'd been placed under investigation by the Office of Inspector General for falsifying documentation linked to a federal recognition process. Natalie's name followed shortly after, flagged for internal review and placed on administrative leave from her DOJ post. They didn't see it coming. For so many years, They had moved in silence, confident in the assumption that no one would question the gaps, that I'd remain quiet, that I'd never return, not in uniform, not in strength, and certainly not with the truth in hand. But I did. I was no longer the girl sitting silently at the family table, waiting to be acknowledged. I was the woman who had earned her place through war, loss, service, and sacrifice. And now, it was their turn to be questioned. Weeks passed, but the echoes of that tribunal never faded. Margaret tried to downplay it. She released a formal statement through her attorney, claiming the altered files were a misunderstanding, an attempt to protect family privacy. But the evidence was too precise, too intentional, too damning. When the investigation team uncovered the digital fingerprint linking her personal IP address to multiple record modifications, her credibility cracked. Natalie stayed quiet. Not a word, not a text, not even a shallow apology. She simply vanished into the bureaucratic shadows where she had once thrived, now suspended, stripped of her clearance, pending further review. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt relief. For once, I wasn't haunted by a hollow space where acknowledgement should have been. One morning, I received an email from the Department of Defense. Subject: Public Recognition, Service Reinstatement Notice. It wasn't a grand announcement, just a quiet, official letter confirming that my Medal of Honor nomination had been revived, verified, and approved. They offered a private ceremony. I accepted. The day of the ceremony, I wore my full dress uniform. It wasn't about the medal. It was about standing in a room where no one was allowed to deny I existed. Colonel Ellison stood beside me, his shoulders squared with pride. The small room held only a few dignitaries, military colleagues, and 2 officers from my last deployment unit. Melissa stood in the back, her eyes misty. I didn't invite Margaret, or Natalie, or anyone from that side of my fractured home. They had lost the right to witness it. When the medal was pinned to my chest, I didn't think about combat, or blood, or the cold nights I spent in tents a world away. I thought about the first time I walked into my father's house after basic training, carrying my bag, heart full of hope, only to be met by Margaret's polite but distant smile and Natalie's judgmental gaze. They never saw me. Not then. And not for years after. But now, the nation had. After the ceremony, Melissa took a photo of me on the steps of the administration building, sunlight shining off the medal, shoulders back, expression steady. She smiled as she reviewed the photo. I always knew they couldn't erase you, she said. I smiled. But they tried. Later that evening, I sat at the War Memorial Park near the base, watching a group of school kids walk past the engraved names. One little girl pointed up at the bronze plaques and asked her father, "Who are they?" He replied softly, "Heroes." And I finally felt at peace. Not because I had proven something to the world, but because I had reclaimed what had been stolen. My voice, my truth, my name. I walked forward, feeling lighter than I had in years. The battle was over. Not the one overseas, but the one that had lived inside me far longer. I had won. And no one, no stepmother, no stepsister, no forged document, would ever bury me again.